Get off turn. Afternoon. We are so pleased that you are joining us for a very, very important hearing on behalf of our Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. First, let me thank all the witnesses for joining us and for your hard work on behalf of the residents of District of Columbia. You know, DC is a vibrant city with a unique history, an amazing architecture, and a culture of its own. It's the home of Mumbo Sauce and Ben's Chili Bowl and go-go music and the National Symphony Orchestra, the world-famous Smithsonian Institution, and the world champion Nationals. Although I have to say for the record that my Detroit Tigers still have them beat by 3. Most of all, it's home to more than 700,000 Americans, patriotic, hardworking people who are passionate about their city and making their country a better place. Unfortunately, their voices do not have the full power they deserve because they do not have 2 elected United States senators and members of Congress like every other American in our country who lives outside of the District of Columbia has. Last week, the U.S. House of Representatives passed H.R. 51, which would admit the new state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth as the 51st state. It was a historic day, and it was a long time coming. For far, far too long, the people of this city have been shut out of full participation in our political process. As I mentioned, they have no voting member of Congress. They didn't even get to vote for the President of the United States, their neighbor on Pennsylvania Avenue, until 1964. Meanwhile, these Americans keep our federal government running, serve in our military, and pay the most per capita federal taxes in the United States. This lack of representation isn't just unfair, it's fundamentally a civil rights issue. The majority of citizens of DC are people of color, and they're treated as less than full Americans. It's past time to make this right. And I'm excited to hear from our panel today about what statehood would mean for DC residents. And I'm very excited now to turn this to our Democratic leader, who I know is excited about moving forward as well, Senator Chuck Schumer.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for putting this great thing together. I want to thank my colleagues for joining us from the greater Capital Region. Senator Kane, Senator Van Holland, and I guess even Senator Carper. Southern Delaware is probably the greater Capital Region too. So thank you, and I want to thank Senator Klobuchar, our ranking member on the Rules Committee, as well for joining us, and so many of our great luminaries from DC, including our mayor and our representative in the House. It's great for you all to be here. And I want to start by talking about how the people of DC deserve equal representation in Congress, entitled to all Americans. And I'll get to that in a moment. but I feel compelled to respond to a press conference my Republican friends just held in opposition to DC statehood. We just heard from Senators Daines and Cotton and Graham about DC residents, and what they said, what Daines and Cotton and Graham said was utterly despicable, referring to DC residents. Speaking about his opposition to statehood, the junior senator from Montana said that lawmakers should go, quote, go out to where the real people are across the country and ask them what they think. This is a dehumanizing statement about 700,000 hardworking people in the District of Columbia, plain and simple. Here is the truth. The city is home to hundreds of thousands of Americans, most of whom are Black, who hold everyday jobs just like everyone else. They educate our kids and deliver our groceries. They care for our sick and work at our restaurants and churches and protect the people who work in the Capitol. They aren't rich, they aren't connected, and they work just as hard as everyone else to keep up. So I'll say this to our Republican senators. After your meeting at the Heritage Foundation or the Federalist Society, and after your dinner at the fancy steakhouse with big oil lobbyists, why don't you take a walk in some DC neighborhoods and ask some of those families if they consider themselves real people? Again, what Daines and Cotton and Graham said this afternoon about DC residents was just utterly despicable. To even hint that the residents are not the same as real people, quote unquote, who live just outside the city's boundaries is dehumanizing, disgraceful, and obscene. And here's another truth. Even though the District of Columbia has a larger population than 2 states, it still exists without full congressional representation. So it's long past time to end the historic disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of US citizens, most of whom are Black, and make DC a state. DC residents fulfill all the obligations of citizenship. They pay federal taxes. They can be summoned for jury duty. They've served in every single war since the Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, they are still denied real representation in Congress. The American ideal of self-government will always be incomplete as long as we hold hundreds of thousands of our own citizens at arm's length. Leader McConnell has dismissed the idea that Americans who satisfy the obligations of citizenship should enjoy the full rights and privileges of citizenship, calling it socialism. Well, Leader McConnell, I have a different name for it: democracy. Republicans couch their opposition in constitutional arguments, and they frame democratic efforts to enfranchise hundreds of thousands of American citizens as a power grab. To say that allowing more Americans an equal and full voice in our democracy is bad for Republicans and good for Democrats, that says something right there. It smacks of the same cynicism that compels Republicans, from President Trump all the way down to state legislatures, to sponsor voting restrictions and outright voter suppression in state after state after state. The Republican Party, unfortunately, has truly entered a dark age when its leaders are forced to argue against more Americans voting because it could hurt their party at the payrolls. Self-governance and equal representation aren't Democratic issues or Republican issues. Full access to democracy and self-determination benefits all Americans. This is an issue of fairness, of equality, not right or left. It's about right and wrong. That's why I'm a proud sponsor of my colleague, Senator Carper's bill, the Washington, D.C. Admissions Act, which would eliminate this double and disenfranchisement, finally giving DC full voting rights and full home rule. When I become majority leader, God willing, one of my top priorities when it comes to voting rights and democracy reform will be securing DC statehood. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, everybody. Sorry I have to run, but this is exciting, important, and we're going to get it done.
Well, thank you, Senator Schumer. We are excited to work with you to make sure that that happens. So thank you very much. I want to turn this over to our great co-chairs. Before turning over to Senator Carper, let me thank Senator Van Hollen, who really has been a leader for so many years in the U.S. House and now joining us as part of our Senate team, Senator Cardin and Warner and Kane, all of which are important voices, important leaders as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Senator Carper, who has been championing DC statehood since 2013. He has introduced the bill for DC statehood in the Senate 4 different times. And this Congress, the Senate bill has 40 co-sponsors, which is incredible. So Senator Carper, thank you for your tenacity and leadership. And I'm going to turn this over to you and our colleagues to chair the meeting.
Thank you, Debbie. Great to be with you. Thank you so much to you and your staff for to DPCC for helping to make this possible today. And I said earlier, for those of you who weren't on the line, I talked about NASCAR, and I said I'm drafting in not in the race car. I'm drafting on Chris Van Hollen because he's been working on this for a long time. And I know that Tim and Eleanor even further before that, Amy, Ben. It's a great partnership we have, and we're excited about it. I people sometimes ask me, Debbie, why a U.S. senator from Delaware might be interested in trying to make Washington, D.C. a state. I tell them for me, this issue is all about fairness. We all know, we've all heard about the golden rule: forever treat other people the way we want to be treated. For me, if I lived here, I'd want to be treated so that I had a voice, an action, and a vote in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And in Delaware, we have a few more people than Washington has. We have about 1 million people now. We have 2 senators. We have a congresswoman, and Eleanor, you know Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's our congresswoman, and she's a force to be reckoned with. We love her. She used to be my Secretary of Labor when I was governor. We called her Secretary of Love, and she's a dynamo. But the well, we have at least three people in our delegation to serve us in the Congress. The same goes for Wyoming. Same goes for Vermont. As we know, those states have fewer residents than does Washington, D.C. And if they deserve representation in Congress, it's kind of hard to argue that the Washington, D.C. does not. And it's already been mentioned that the folks in D.C. pay more federal taxes than, I'm told, residents of 22 states. Talk about taxation without representation. They actually pay the most per capita. I think Debbie has mentioned that. Some have argued in recent days that while this may be true, D.C. can't be trusted with statehood, but an argument could be made that Washington, D.C. is actually better run than most states and just as capable as any to take on the responsibilities of statehood. In fact, Washington, D.C. has a AAA credit rating. Delaware, when I was state treasurer, I was elected treasurer, and we had the worst credit rating in the country. We're tied with Puerto Rico for dead last. They were embarrassed to be with us. By comparison, Washington, D.C. has a AAA credit rating. How does that compare to the rest of our states, the 50 states? Well, that's better than 35 other states if we're talking about the ability to manage one's finances. It's also been suggested that D.C. is too reliant on the federal government to be a state, but thanks to the efforts by Mayor Bowser, Mayor, it's great to be with you. Great to the efforts of Mayor Bowser and others over the year to diversify the city's economy. The percentage of DC residents working for the federal government is not going up. It's actually going lower than it's been in the past. And on top of that, the percentage of Washington, D.C.'s annual budget that comes from federal tax dollars is lower than in a number of states. And despite all of this, D.C. residents and their local elected leaders must routinely deal with the president and legislators from outside of D.C. interfering in their affairs or even stopping them from spending their local tax dollars. President Trump's unilateral decision last month to deploy federal troops to break up a peaceful protest in D.C. brought home for many people, the reality of what those who live here have to deal with every day. He wouldn't be able to get away with doing that in Delaware or any of the other states that are represented here. I hope my colleagues come away from this discussion today with a better understanding of what a lack of representation in Congress means to our panelists and the people for whom they speak. As DC residents have reminded me over the years, there's more to this city than just these buildings where we work, more than just the monuments, more than just the museums on the mall. People live here. People work here. People raise their families here, just like they do in our state. So as we prepare to celebrate the 4th of July, the day we set out to end taxation without representation in our country, we should redouble our efforts to finally give DC residents a say in how our federal government is run. So thanks everybody for being a part of this and for letting me join all of you. And with that, one of the early leaders in all of this, Chris Van Hollen. Chris, would you please make some remarks, please? And then I think I'll deal it after Chris to I believe would be Ben Carden. Then and then we'll take it. We'll see who shows up. All right, take it away, Chris.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. And I want to start as you did by thanking Senator Debbie Stabenow for bringing us together under the policy group. So I know she had to leave us, but great thanks to Debbie. Thank you to Tom Carper for your steadfast leadership over so many years. And as you said, this is just the right thing to do. And that's why it was great to see the House take its historic action. And now we must take up this cause in the United States Senate and pass it. Really thrilled to be here with my colleagues representing states that neighbor the District of Columbia, from Maryland, Ben Cardin, and then of course Senators Kaine and Warner. Thank all of them. We want to be joined by two senators from the District of Columbia to give this region even more robust representation. I really want to salute and thank my good friend, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. I had the privilege of serving with her in the House of Representatives, including together on the House Oversight Committee. Thank you for being such a tenacious advocate for the District of Columbia. And Mayor Bowser, you've faced many challenges since you've been mayor. It's been a great privilege to work with you in many areas, but thank you for your leadership, DC, through COVID-19, and of course, trying to protect the rights of peaceful protesters rising up against injustice. Monica Hopkins has been a great voice from the ACLU. I know we're going to hear from her. And Mr. Lee has been a pillar of the U Street business community. And Major Rimmon Snyder, of course, has served our nation in the National Guard and the city with the Metropolitan Police Department. It's great to have all of them. I just also want to give a shout out to the shadow senators, Paul Strauss and Michael Brown, for their advocacy, and so many others who've been a part of this. We all watched that historic moment just last week when Speaker Pelosi, together with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton and others, passed DC statehood in the House of Representatives. It's been a long time coming, but that was a very important step. And as Senator Schumer said, we are determined to bring that up in the Senate. And if Mitch McConnell won't, but either way, we're just going to replace Mitch McConnell so that we can bring that up first thing next year. I do want to briefly comment on the really outrageous bad faith arguments that have been made against DC statehood in the last couple days. Senator Schumer referred to some of those. The notion that DC residents are somehow not real people because all they know is the federal government shows an incredible and willful ignorance, I think, of the people of the District of Columbia. And I wish my colleagues would themselves get out and about a little more, get outside the Capitol and go down to see small businesses like Lee's Flowers, as well as startups and entrepreneurs and restaurants, whether it be U Street or other important parts of the great city we have here. And I think all my colleagues from Maryland, I know Ben Cardin, and also my Virginia partners will tell you that really the only difference between our constituents on different sides of the District of Columbia and Maryland border, and Virginia as well, but if you look at towns right along the District of Columbia border with Maryland, places like Capitol Heights, Mount Rainier, Chevy Chase, our constituents pretty much are the exact same in the sense of what drives them in the morning. The only thing that's different is that arbitrary line drawn, and on one side of the line in Maryland, Virginia, everyone's got voting rights in federal elections, whereas on the DC side of the line, they don't. And that is a national disgrace. We need to remedy that. As has been said, the District of Columbia pays more taxes than people in 22 other states, including the states of some of those senators who were just, talking about how DC doesn't, somehow carry its weight. So we need to address these issues. I'll just close with this. As someone who serves on the Appropriations Committee, it's been outrageous to see how senators from these other states treat the District of Columbia like it's their own sort of personal political plaything, essentially imposing conditions on the people of the District of Columbia. They would never allow that to happen in their states. Their governors would never allow that to happen in their states. And the mayor and the council of the District of Columbia should have all those full rights as well. So I want to thank everybody for having us. Let me now turn it over to my friend, my partner, the senior senator from the state of Maryland, Ben Carper.
Well, to Senator Van Hollen, thank you so much for your extraordinary leadership on this issue. To Tom Carper, thank you for your continued support and leadership in getting DC as our 51st state, and to my other colleagues, Senator Kane and Warner. We are committed on this. Senator Stabenow, thank you for your leadership. Mayor Bowser, it's always good to see you, even if it is on the internet. Welcome to all my colleagues. Eleanor Holmes Norton, thank you. Good to see you again, and enjoyed our service in the House. I just really want to add one additional point to this. There is no democratic country in the world where the citizens of the capital city do not have representation in the national legislature. The United States is an outlier among democratic states. You can't justify this under any scenario. It's a basic violation of human rights. Now, I have another role that I play. I am the senior Democrat on the Helsinki Commission. I've been on the Helsinki Commission for many years. Eleanor, you've joined us to some of our events there. I've raised this issue in our international forums that the United States is violating the commitments it made in 1975 in Helsinki to support basic human rights for its citizens. We have violated international human rights, and it needs to be corrected. This should never be a partisan issue. Human rights should never be a partisan issue. I am so disappointed by the comments I hear from my Republican colleagues. This is so long overdue to get this done. And thank you, Senator Schumer, for your commitment. And it gives us one additional reason to recognize that elections have consequences, and we have to make sure this November we get the type of leaders in this country that we desperately need, so that not just the people of the district can get the representation they're entitled to and the status that they're entitled to, but we can have the type of leadership in this country that understands what is going on here and recognizes that we're still on that path for equal justice in America, and we need to continue that fight. So I want to thank all the panelists and thank you for your commitment to this. Recognize that we're not going to end until we get full statehood for the district.
Senator Tim Kaine, you want to take it away, buddy?
Hey guys, listen, what a treat to be on, and I won't go through all the individual thanks. I'll just use a Virginia phrase. If you want to thank one person, you say thank y'all. If you want to thank a group of people, you say thank all y'all. Thank all y'all. Here's what I want to say. I want to talk about history. I want to talk about prejudice, and I want to talk about optimism. So history. There is a clear history in this nation of when is a group of American citizens who are not recognized with statehood, when are they ready for statehood? And there's two criteria that have been used throughout history. The first is you have to have sufficient population. Now, for the original joiners, the Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, that wasn't the issue. But let's use Michigan as an example, because Debbie Stabenow is on. Michigan came in the 1830s, and at that time, Congress said, when you get to have 60,000 people, you can petition for statehood. So throughout our history, you have to get to a sufficient population size. I think it is beyond argument that once your population is larger than other American states, you've met that threshold. DC has met the threshold. And the second question that was always one that would be examined is, was there a long demonstrated desire for statehood? Not just flash in the pan, one referendum, but a long demonstrated desire. And when that happens, that's the second criteria. DC has shown that. The 2016 referendum in DC for statehood produced 85% plus, I believe, for statehood, and the desire for statehood has been a very long time. So DC has met the criteria. American citizens who don't have their own state, who have a community, you've met the criteria that we've applied throughout our history. That's point one, history. Number two, the reality of prejudice. The two states that had the hardest time joining the Union, even though they met the criteria, were New Mexico and Hawaii. The biggest obstacle to New Mexico was Spanish speakers, Mexican heritage, American Indians. And so in the early 1900s, that was very, very tough for New Mexico. And in the 1950s, extremely difficult for Hawaii to join the Union because of the predominantly Asian American population. Sadly, Virginia legislators, including a House member, Howard Smith, who chaired the Rules Committee at the time, made it very, very difficult for the state of Hawaii with a predominantly minority population to join. So look, DC has met the criteria, but bluntly, DC is also up against what has been a challenge in the past, prejudice against communities that are majority minority. This would be a great win in terms of meeting our history, but would also be a good civil rights win. The last point that I want to make is this. It's a point about optimism and confidence. What sends a louder message about our optimism about our country than adding states? Traditionally, that was how we showed that we were a growing, expanding, confident country. The addition of states. We haven't added states for nearly 70 years. I think the addition of a new state would show that we are not turning inward. We're not putting up the drawbridge or digging the moat deeper. We still have a lot to offer, and we're still proud to keep growing because we're proud of the path that our country is on. I think DC statehood would be exactly the right kind of positive and optimistic message about the future of this country that we could send, and I'm really proud to be a supporter of the effort. And now I'm not sure if my colleague, Senator Warner, is on. If he is, he's been a longtime champion of this and is maybe the closest neighbor to the Capitol. He can battle with Chris and Ben about as the crow fly miles between house and work. But if Mark is on, I know he would want to say some words, and if not, maybe we'll go back to Tom Carper to begin the moderated discussion.
Tim, thanks very much. Mark has not joined us yet. I think he may be joining us for the Q&A. He's working on his questions right now. I expect we'll see him in a short while. Thank you to each of my colleagues. Just thank you so much for those wonderful, wonderful words. When now the next thing we get to do, we're used to talking on our side. Now we get to do some listening, and we're fortunate to be able to listen to the voice starting off of Congresswoman Norton, and great to see her. She'll be followed by Mayor Bowers, who will be followed by Mr. Hopkins, who will be followed by Mr. Lee, and then Mr. Ryman Snyder. Do I have that right, James? Ryman Snyder?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's correct.
Good enough. All right. Where did you get that name? What kind of name is that?
German, sir.
I thought it might be. All right. I got just a short intro for 5 people who really don't need much of an introduction, but let me offer short intros. Eleanor Holmes Norton will be leading us. Congresswoman Norton is service as the at-large Congresswoman for the District of Columbia for 15 terms, elected at the age of 28. What it says. Service. Prior to her congressional service, she served as the first woman to chair. Is this true, Eleanor? U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission, did you? Is that true? Her work for full congressional voting representation and full democracy for the people of the District of Columbia continues her lifelong struggle for universal human and civil rights. Eleanor's going to be followed by Mayor of District of Columbia, Muriel Bowser. Prior to election in 2015, she represented DC's 4th Ward on the City Council, and among her many accomplishments as mayor, she spearheaded the 2016 voter referendum on DC statehood, in which more than 85% of voters approved of statehood. Great to see you, Mayor. Thank you for so much for joining us. Next will be Monica. I'm looking for Monica on my screen. There you are, Monica. Monica Hopkins, who has served as the executive director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia since 2014. She oversees numerous efforts to defend and advance the civil rights and civil liberties of DC residents. And after Ms. Hopkins, we'll hear from two lifelong DC residents and advocates for full voting rights for themselves and for their neighbors. First will be Rick Lee, the owner of Lee's Flowers and Card Shop on, is it U Street? Mr. Lee, is that U Street? I think it is. And Mr. Lee will speak to his experience growing a small business in DC after taking the shop over from his parents in the late 1960s. And then we'll end up with a fellow with German heritage named James Nelson Ryman Snyder. Great. People, has anyone ever mispronounced your name, James? Maybe once or twice.
No, sir, never.
All right. He was waitlisted at the Naval Academy and had to go to West Point. I'm a Navy guy. Different uniforms, James, but same team. A West Point graduate and a major in U.S. Army Reserve, currently assigned to the Military Intelligence Readiness Command at Fort Belvoir. He previously served during Operation Iraqi Freedom as a platoon leader and an intelligence officer. I was once an intelligence officer with my squadron. So in this case, Navy salutes Army. Welcome aboard, everybody. And Eleanor will recognize you first. Lead us on. Thank you.
Well, I begin by thanking Senator Tom Carper. He is the chief sponsor of our DC statehood bill in the Senate, and what a job he has done in attracting co-sponsors. He's already gotten 2/3 of the Democrats to co-sponsor, and Senator, I saw them coming on one by one just last week. You're continuing in this really extraordinary work. I want to thank others who've spoken, Leader Stabenow, Chairwoman, Leader Schumer, Chairwoman Stabenow. I want to thank our senators, our neighboring senators, Chris Van Hollen, Senator Ben Cardin, Senator Tim Kaine. They have been extraordinary leaders in this fight, and in every fight, because we're having to fight for more than statehood, we're having to fight just to keep our own budget intact. On behalf of I want to thank our witnesses whom you have named, and I thank you, Senator Carper. They are well chosen to speak to the issue before the Senate today. And of course, I speak on behalf of myself and the American citizens I represent. I want to thank you for holding this hearing that could not be more timely. Just 3 working days since last Friday, when the House of Representatives passed H.R. 51 decisively, marking the first time either chamber of Congress has passed the District of Columbia statehood bill. Yet we have been your nation's capital for 219 years. Your hearing, coming on the heels of the passage of our House bill, demonstrates the readiness of Senate Democrats to ensure our DC statehood bill gets immediate attention. In a few days, Americans will celebrate Independence Day. However, the oldest slogan, no taxation without representation, and the principle of consent of the governed still does not apply to the American citizens living in our nation's capital. This hearing is important because it lays the groundwork for a Senate majority to pass the DC statehood bill next Congress, when Senate Democrats are doing so well as I speak, with the possibility of taking control of the Senate. Since our city was created almost 220 years ago, the Senate has never even voted on the DC statehood bill. I also want to thank Senator Carper, our longtime Senate sponsor and my partner over the years on the DC statehood bill, for his most extraordinary work. Senator Carper has achieved a record 40 co-sponsors of the bill. That's the most ever, including the entire Democratic leadership. And he is adding senators at an impressive pace, all by himself. That does not come from this side of the Congress. It comes from Senator Carper. The United States is the only democratic country that denies both voting rights in its national legislature and local autonomy to the residents of its nation's capital. The Senate has both the moral obligation and the constitutional authority to end this injustice. DC statehood has both the facts and the Constitution on its side. The Constitution does not establish any prerequisites for states, but Congress generally has considered three factors in admission decisions: resources and population, support for statehood, and commitment to democracy. DC pays more federal taxes per capita than any state and pays more federal taxes than 22 states. That ought to be the ticket to admission, nothing else said, in a country that was created on no taxation without representation. DC's population of 705,000 citizens is larger than those of 2 states, and the new state would be one of 7 states with a population of under 1 million. The city's $15.5 billion budget is larger than that of 12 states, and DC's AAA bond rating is higher than those of 35 states. DC has a higher per capita personal income and gross domestic product than any state of the union. 86% of DC's residents voted for statehood in 2016. In fact, DC residents have been fighting for many more years than that, for more than 2 centuries. The Constitution's admissions clause gives Congress the authority to admit new states, and all 37 new states have been admitted by an act of Congress. The Constitution's district clause sets a maximum size of the federal district of 100 square miles. It does not set a minimum size. Congress previously has changed the size of the federal district, including reducing it by 30% in 1846. Over the last few months, the world has witnessed the discriminatory and outrageous treatment of DC residents by the Republican-controlled Senate and the Trump administration. In March, Congress passed the CARES Act, which deprived DC of $5 million in coronavirus fiscal relief by treating DC as a territory for the first time in history, rather than a state. I have gotten these funds replaced in the House-passed HEROES Act. Last month, federal police and out-of-state National Guard troops occupied DC to respond to largely peaceful protests. This occupation occurred slowly because the president thought he could get away with it here. He was wrong. I seek statehood for the Americans I am honored to represent. At the same time, DC statehood is deeply personal for me. My great-grandfather, Richard Holmes, escaped slavery from a Virginia plantation, made it as far as the district, walked to freedom, but not to equal citizenship. For 3 generations, my family has been denied the rights other Americans take for granted. The Senate has 2 choices. It can continue to exercise undemocratic or autocratic authority over the 705 million American citizens, 705,000 American citizens who reside in our nation's capital, treating them, in the words of Frederick Douglass, as, quotes, aliens, not citizens, but subjects, end quote. Or the Senate can live up to this nation's promise and ideals and pass our DC statehood bill. The mission during this remainder of this Congress for DC officials, DC residents, and our millions of allies across the country is clear. We need to educate the American people about DC statehood and continue to build support for our DC statehood bill in the Senate as we are doing today. Today's hearing is just the start HR 51 needs. Thank you very much, Senator Carper.
Congresswoman Norton, let me just thank you. You're very kind in your comments about my work on this, but your efforts over the years make mine look very small indeed. We're only as good as the staff people that we have around us, and I'm blessed to have John Kilvington as my staff director on our permanent subcommittee on investigation. We've been working on this for a long time. He's from Delaware, but he lives in Washington, D.C. He's like a dog with a bone. And you're tenacious on this, and so are the rest of us, but he is really that dog with a bone. He's committed to it, and I'm grateful for all of his help. We're now going to hear from our mayor, and Mayor Bowser. It's just a treat to see you, and thank you so much for your leadership, and great to be with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator. And I am tempted to follow my friend from Virginia's lead in saying thank all y'all. And I'm going to be using that frequently. Thank you for that one, Senator. But I especially want to call out a few people and thank you for your leadership in fighting for us and your continued fight for us. And you, Senator Carper, for introducing this bill on several occasions, bringing on a historic number of sponsors and your continued fight for us. We're grateful to Leader Schumer for his commitment to DC statehood and fighting to protect funds for DC, Chairwoman Stabenow for inviting us today, and of course, our Congresswoman who shepherded and championed the winning vote in the House of Representatives last week. It brings me great pleasure to speak on behalf of 706,000 Washingtonians and tax-paying Americans. And I'll argue to you today that the disenfranchisement of 706,000 residents of Washington, D.C. is the most overlooked civil rights issue of modern day America. And the most troubling aspect of this blatant violation is that it's rooted in slavery. I spoke last week about why I think talking about slavery is important to the statehood discussion. Appropriately, we are reminded of a statement from Winston Churchill when he said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you can see." And when we look back at slavery, unfortunately, we find that the lack of representation for DC residents was not an oversight. According to the White House historian Lena Mann, for the first 72 years of its existence, the nation's capital harbored one of America's most difficult historical truths and greatest contradictions, and that is slavery. The placement of the nation's capital along the Potomac River in between Maryland and Virginia slaveholding states ensured that slavery would be ingrained in every aspect of life, including our buildings, institutions, and the social fabric of our Washington, D.C. And with the seat of government firmly on the banks of the Potomac, slavery flourished in the new capital, much to the chagrin of the North. In fact, during the New York Convention, New York delegate Thomas Treadwell declared that the plan of the district departs from every principle of freedom because the inhabitants of the district are subject to the exclusive legislation of the Congress. They have no share in a vote. And many of the Constitutional Convention members agreed with this point, and Alexander Hamilton proposed language to grant representation in the Congress once the population reached a certain number. Ultimately, Hamilton's proposal failed, and 2 centuries of federal leadership has also failed to rectify the situation. So now today, 232 years later, Washington, D.C. still has no vote in Congress, and we know that now is the time to rectify this wrong of our democracy. A cursory review of history makes clear that slavery was the root cause of this disenfranchisement. The simple reason was that DC was designed to be a majority Black city, a city with slave inhabitants, a city designed with a servant class to serve the federal government. And this mindset was the reason why Hamilton proposed, and his proposal was not seriously considered. All Washingtonians were slaves or former slaves, and neither had rights under the Constitution. Even after slavery was abolished, it was this mindset that did not change. And so we appeal to the Senate to help us change this mindset in our city and in America. Statehood for Washington, D.C., as we all know, should have nothing to do with race, wealth, or the political affiliations of Washingtonians. Representation within this body is enshrined in the Constitution for every American. And to deny us this representation is fundamentally unfair and a denial of our civil rights. With these facts in mind, we are all personally offended by the remarks of your colleague, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who argued against DC statehood on the floor last week. His arguments are not new and were surprisingly direct about admitting about how the opponents feel about DC statehood. And he made very clear that Washingtonians are simply the wrong kind of people. He argued that because we have fewer workers in mining, logging, construction, and manufacturing, that we are somehow less worthy of representation than the residents of the more well-rounded state of Wyoming. He asserted that the June demonstrations here in Washington were reasons to disenfranchise Washingtonians, rather than to recognize that disenfranchisement is the cause of a broader movement. He argued that Washingtonians have undue influence with the federal government. And I would argue that the recent events illustrated just how wrong that claim is, that an unwieldy federal government, in fact, can encroach and violate the rights of its citizens. Washington, D.C., is treated like a state or for federal grant purposes for 40 years. And recently, as our Congresswoman noted, and Senator Van Hollen has noted, that we have been shorted $755 million in the midst of our response to this pandemic. Even while we were announced as an American hotspot some weeks ago. We've worked with our residents and businesses, however, to drive down our numbers and significantly blunt the curve in Washington, D.C. You've heard from our Congresswoman, and you've stated yourself plainly that we're not begging, we're not a beggar state, we are a donor state. We pay more than we get back from the federal government. We have a sufficient number of people. We manage our finances and our government in an extraordinary way, and our residents are satisfied with how we work to do all of those things. Still, we do not have the full autonomy and representation that only statehood can guarantee. We operate today, as you know, under limited home rule, which is also demonstrative of a mindset that we cannot manage our own affairs. Washington, D.C.'s budget is subject to congressional approval. Congress has the power to override our laws that have been democratically passed, and also the will of our voters can be overturned by referenda that they pass. Members of Congress pass laws for Washington, D.C. that do not bind their own states to their whims. Our citizens are also prosecuted by federal authorities for local crimes. And even with these limitations, we already do the things that states do. You sometimes hear me say that I am the mayor, the county executive, and the governor all at once. We operate our own schools. We manage our state Medicaid programs. We receive federal block grants. And like states, we issue driver's licenses, license plates, birth and death certificates. We regulate banks and insurance companies. We operate our state-based affordable care marketplace, and we enforce environmental regulations. And for the purpose of thousands of other federal laws and regulations, we act as a state and we do it well. And so let me just finally say, Senator, that there was a lot of talk about the claim that the Constitution requires a federal district. The Constitution, as you know, sets a maximum size of 10 miles squared for the federal district, but it does not prescribe a minimum size. Congresswoman Norton's bill and also your bill makes clear that there will be a federal district, that the Congress will continue to exercise authority over that district. That district will continue to have all of the major federal buildings, monuments, memorials, Smithsonian's, National Mall, and all of the policing services that exist now, including the Capitol Police, the Secret Service, the Park Police, to support the federal district. The Washington Admission Act clearly leaves this district in place. Our fellow Americans from all over the states will still come to the nation's capital in that federal district and enjoy all the amenities of the nation's capital. And so as my Congresswoman ended, for us, we are doing what our residents sent us to do and fighting for statehood, but we are also real lives examples of people born in their town. We feel like we were lucky to be born here in Washington, D.C., but we also feel that it's our duty to fight to make sure that we're fully represented and deliver that to the residents of the District of Columbia. I can't hear him.
Thank you for those words. Thank you for those words. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being with us today. We'll now hear from Monica Hopkins. The mayor was going like this. The mayor was going just like this, kind of a cue to me to unmute. So thank you. You're getting an assist on the play. All right, Monica, take it away.
Thank you, Senator Carper, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm Monica Hopkins, Executive Director of the ACLU of DC. Voting is the cornerstone of our democracy and the fundamental right upon which all our civil liberties rest. However, for over 200 years, Congress has denied the residents of the District of Columbia voting representation in our federal government, a denial steeped in the racism of Reconstruction. This disenfranchisement, coupled with the congressional ability to undemocratically alter DC's local laws, is an unjust and unacceptable deprivation of the fundamental right to representation, self-determination, and participation in our democracy. Through disapproval resolutions, budget riders, or direct legislation, Congress exercises authoritarian rule over the district, and district residents have no recourse to hold them accountable through a democratic process. For example, in 1998, Congress prevented the implementation of a needle exchange program, resulting in DC having the highest rates of HIV and AIDS in the country and hundreds of district residents dying. Congress regularly attaches the Dornan Amendment to an annual appropriations bill blocking local district tax dollars to provide abortion coverage for individuals enrolled in Medicaid, something states are free to do. In addition to overt congressional interference with policies supported by the district's people, the district lacks control over its criminal system. This has profound impact on the thousands of DC residents. Today, as a state, DC would have the highest incarceration rate in the country, and the absence of local control makes local reform near impossible. DC judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the US Senate, where district residents have no representation at all. Felonies and various adult misdemeanors are prosecuted by a federally appointed US attorney with little incentive to be transparent or accountable to the DC community. Last September, the district's Trump-appointed U.S. attorney took steps to aggressively oppose effective sentencing reform backed by locally elected officials. And the Federal Parole Commission drives over incarceration in the district. In 2018, 76% of the caseload were DC code offenders. The commission also revoked supervised release for minor technical violations, including in the case of DC resident Tyrone Hall, who was sent back to prison for 13 months, even though he was acquitted of the misdemeanor charge that triggered his parole violation. Finally, across the nation, there is a call for an end to the systems and structures that create, maintain, and perpetuate racial inequality. Granting DC statehood is a way to end such historic racial inequality. In 1867, Congress overrode President Johnson's veto and granted all male citizens in the district, including Black men, the right to vote. However, just as the district's Black community became increasingly politically active, Congress replaced DC's territorial government with 3 presidentially appointed commissioners. Congressional members at the time cited DC as a model for a national segregationist policy. The continued disenfranchisement of DC residents perpetuates this shameful racist history. DC statehood is therefore part of this national movement for a just democracy, self-determination, and racial justice. The ACLU and a number of legal scholars, including former senior Bush Justice Department official Viet Den, have found that granting statehood through an act of Congress to be unequivocally constitutional. However, 3 constitutional arguments against the DC Admissions Act have been advanced by those who oppose statehood. We have provided a thorough and rigorous analysis of these arguments, which we present in our written testimony. Briefly, however, we conclude the act is constitutional under the District and Federal Enclaves Clause, the Admissions Clause, and the 23rd Amendment. First, the act does not violate the District and Federal Enclaves Clause because the act simply reduces the size of the district. It does not do away with it entirely. Thus, it does not violate the clause. Second, there is no Admissions Clause issue, which gives Congress expansive power to admit new states. Critics argue that Maryland holds a reversionary interest in the land it ceded to the federal government, which now make up the District of Columbia, so the federal government cannot now cede this land to create a new state. But this land has not been part of Maryland for over 200 years, and basic principles of property law clearly support that Maryland does not retain a reversionary interest in the land. Third, the act is not at odds with the 23rd Amendment, which grants presidential electors for the District of Columbia. While the 23rd Amendment raises important policy considerations, it does not render the act unconstitutional. And finally, arguments that the new state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth fails to meet the minimum requirements of statehood fail because such requirements are policy concerns, not constitutional limitations. Continued congressional control of the District of Columbia and its residents undermines fundamental principles of self-government and is antithetical to a free and just society. To right the injustices of the past and fulfill the promises of the Constitution, it is beyond time to give DC residents the basic right of self-governance that comes with statehood. Thank you for the time.
Monica Hopkins, thank you so much. Wonderful to see you. Thank you for your testimony today. And we're going to turn to Rick Lee. Mr. Lee, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Please proceed. Thank you. Great to see you.
All right. Thank you. Well, first off, I just want to say that I'm honored to be able to speak on behalf of statehood. I'm also honored to be speaking on at the same time or on the same platform as the 2 wonderful, strong women that are leading Washington, D.C. Eleanor Holmes Norton and my very, very good friend. Now I've got to remember her name. I'm just kidding. She knows better than that. Muriel Bowser and her family. We've been close for years and years. And it's ironic that they would ask me to speak because, and I don't even think anybody knew this, but I was a statehood commissioner appointed by Harry Thomas in Ward 5. It had to be at least 30 years ago. And so I've come full circle, it seems. Anyway, I just want to give you a little bit of my story and why I think it's important for us to have statehood. Everyone knows me as Rick. I'm 76 years old. And I've been in Washington, D.C. area for 70 years, but since my mom and dad came from Montreal, Canada, and decided to open a flower shop on U Street. This is in 1945. And so that, I think, is very significant. This is our 75th anniversary on U Street and in business. U Street was almost totally black when we first started, except for at night when the jazz clubs were patronized by white folks. And they were at least, I would say, at least 300, or it's been told that there was at least 300 black-owned businesses in the U Street corridor. That's including U Street, including 14th Street, 7th Street, that whole area, with at least 300 black-owned businesses back in the day. There were 3 flower shops, there were several funeral homes, there were several, a couple of business schools, there were several clothing stores, and a few record stores. We also had several.
I don't know if you can hear me. Tom Carper. When your head moves to the right, it's difficult to hear you.
Oh, it's moved. Oh, okay. Sorry to hear that. All right, I'll try to do better. I'm reading my other computer. You know, like not computer savvy, but I have another computer right here. That's what I'm reading from. Okay, so
you just pick up where you were left off. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, now I attended schools in the U Street area, and attended elementary school at Grimke, which is right there at the corner of Vermont and U, and is now being renovated. It's going to be a part of the African American Civil War Museum and a couple of other things. But anyway, now we've been doing business on U Street for, like I say, 75 years. But we also, most of our family members have been working at the flower shop also. I have 3 children, Stacy, Scotty, or William, he's older now, call him William, and my daughter, Christy. And so they all went to school in Washington, D.C., as I did, went to McKinley High School and graduated from McKinley. And so did my daughter and my son. My other daughter graduated from Wilson High School. So we're all Washington, D.C. products. We've all been a part of the Washington, D.C. Educational system. My oldest daughter, Stacy, who is running the flower shop now, she graduated from Howard University and from the School of Business. And so she's well qualified, and so is my daughter, Christy. My son lives out in Las Vegas now, has his own business there. And so anyway, just saying that to say that this is a family business. We also I have 3 grandchildren, 3 granddaughters that work at the flower shop from time to time, and also a grandson, and also a great-granddaughter that helped us out on Valentine this year. She sweeps the floor and things like that. Okay, so our shop has received many awards and has gotten national attention many times, especially when my mom was here, and she's passed on, but she was here, and she went down to the White House with Betty Ford and helped decorate the White House at Christmas time and at other different times of the year. And so it was just a wonderful thing. And we continue to travel around the USA doing, can you hear me? Make sure you can hear me. Okay, they're doing designing, and we've had a wonderful time in Washington, but we've received numerous awards for not only longevity, but for excellence and perseverance. Along with Ben's Chili Bowl and Industrial Bank, we have sustained our presence on U Street, and we're continuing to blend in with the new world order that's taking place in the U Street corridor. So I recall the days when our area was predominantly Black, and I am certainly fond of where we are today. We've come a long way, but we're blending right in with the new folk that are there. We've also extended our hours so we could be more available for folk coming off the metro from work and that kind of thing. And we've also been very vocal and active throughout the years, regarding the lack of representation and no voice here that affect businesses and in our area. And so we have some of the highest taxes in this region for businesses, especially real estate taxes, which go up every year. And we have been good neighbors throughout the years, and I'm proud to say that we have been new generation that's up on U Street. So as a statehood commissioner back in the day, I was acutely aware of the need to move and make our case for statehood. Unfortunately, it didn't fly at that time, but hopefully these days, those days are over, and we can move forward to achieve full statehood for the 700,000 plus folk who live here. We can no longer allow this travesty to continue with full representation. And I need to just read a little statement here I got, if I could. I hope my time is not up, but it'll only take a second. It says, as honored as I am today to appear before you, it would have meant a lot to me to have the U.S. Senator I voted for present as well. DC residents reaffirm their support for statehood every election cycle by voting in elections for so-called shadow U.S. senators to present us in the Senate and to be our advocates for statehood here. It is important to DC voters to know that these positions be respected as we move forward in our effort to become the 51st state. And this statement was put forth by Brother Paul Strauss, who is our U.S. shadow senator. That's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Lee, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us all those words, and for reading the words of
My pleasure.
Strauss. Thank you.
My pleasure, sir.
And now, Mr. Ryman Snyder, you are our next speaker, and then we'll go to some questions. But James, take it away. Welcome. Great to see you.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you. I would like to thank Senator Stabenow, Senator Van Hollen, Senator Warner, Congresswoman Norton, and my fellow panelists for inviting me to share my personal thoughts on the district's lack of representation in our national legislature. I'm a lifelong DC resident. I am the son of two hardworking, middle-class parents who raised 3 children to love our neighbors, work hard, and fight injustice. These values, paired with my education, provided my inspiration to serve, and I work hard every day to instill those same values in my 2 daughters. Today, I feel 3 powerful emotions. First is anger. Anger over our treatment as second-class citizens. Second is frustration. Frustration over incorrect, superficial, and sometimes utterly ridiculous reasoning as to why DC residents are undeserving of representation in Congress. In spite of the anger and frustration, though, I also feel confident. I am confident in our democratic values, the strength and example set by my fellow DC citizens, and the value of my city. The strength of our democracy is based on its ability to evolve. We must build upon that strength and challenge the status quo in search of a more inclusive, just, and fair union. The citizens of DC provide me with hope. My experience in combat and as a DC police officer have taught me that hope is far more powerful a catalyst for meaningful, lasting change than anger or frustration. The best way for me to describe the injustice of disenfranchisement is to share a deeply personal story about my service in Iraq. For those who know me well, I don't talk about my time much that I spent in Iraq. In 2008-2009, I was serving as an intelligence officer in eastern Iraq. My duties included weekly meetings with an Iraqi general, where we discussed current events and shared information. During our last meeting in November 2009, we discussed the upcoming Iraqi parliamentary elections. He was increasingly worried their young democracy was flawed and would not survive. He asked for my perspective. I paused a moment to gather my thoughts. I explained to him that no democracy is perfect. Representative government is messy and requires constant evolution. Nowhere is this more evident than the United States. I explained how I, at the time a U.S. Army captain, did not have representation in the United States National Legislature, a right enjoyed by every Iraqi citizen in their own parliament. He was immediately taken aback. I could see disbelief in his eyes, but I could also see at the same time hope. This triggered my own deep emotions. Sitting there in his office, I realized the depressing irony of my own disenfranchisement. I had fought for almost 2 years to ensure Iraqi citizens enjoyed a fundamental democratic right, a right I, as a U.S. citizen, did not enjoy. I had lost dozens of friends. Looking back at the time, I was incredibly proud of my service in Iraq, but it felt bittersweet. My faith wobbled. An incalculable amount of blood and treasure was expended to empower democracy in Iraq, while there was still a critical flaw back home. But hope remained. The recent vote in the House of Representatives and the fierce advocacy of Congresswoman Norton and Mayor Bowser has restored hope and built momentum. I hope as a nation we can look past selfish partisan politics and demand DC residents be granted the same democratic rights as the Iraqi citizens. Finally, I would like to briefly address the comments recently made by Senator Tom Cotton. First, Senator Cotton, the answer is yes. I absolutely trust Mayor Bowser to lead our city. Over the past few months, she has led us through COVID-19, civil unrest, an unprecedented economic downturn, saving countless lives, uniting the city in common cause, and keeping us safe. Our leaders have proven they can run a government as well or better than most. I guess you just have a different definition of leadership. Second, my neighbors, they include a firefighter, a teacher, construction worker, police officer, social worker, bartender, and an Uber driver. All hardworking American citizens who deserve the same rights as a resident of the great state of Wyoming. If you would not be comfortable having the same amount of representation that I have at this very moment, then you should not be commenting at all. Thank you for your dedication, everybody, to this important issue, and that includes my remarks.
Thank you very much. And now we've been joined by Mark Warner. Mark, you're the last senator who's going to be making comments, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Senator Carper. And let me just, I gotta put myself back on. Am I unmuted?
No, now you're fine.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Carper. And I see Senator Kane and Senator Cardin and Holland knew I was going to talk, and he got out of his chair and left. Norton, it's always great to see you, and Mayor Bowser, thank you for all you do. And I want to be just very brief. I know we've got a number of opening statements. I apologize. I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole afternoon. I've been engaged in an intelligence committee hearing that is very relevant to a lot of the issues that we are grappling with. Let me go ahead and acknowledge something that Delegate Norton has known for some time. I may be of the elected officials here, the latest to this issue. As a Virginia governor from 20 years ago and active in Virginia politics, for a long time it was kind of a bit of not a rule of thumb, but a presumption that Virginians were not going to be for DC statehood because of fears of commuter taxes and other issues. And I want to give credit again to Delegate Norton, who in many ways made the first breakthrough with then Congressman Tom Davis, literally many, many years ago. And for fairness reasons, for equity reasons, for representation reasons, I am proud to join my other Democratic senators, and I think virtually the whole Democratic House and Senate caucus, be a proud supporter of DC statehood. I would say to my Republican colleagues who are not there yet, if you can be for DC statehood and live in Northern Virginia, you can be for DC statehood anywhere. And I'm very grateful for Senator Carper's leadership, and I know Debbie Stabenow and others are engaged in this effort as well. And you can count on me, and I know I speak for Tim as well, to do all we can to make sure that we do the same kind of things in the Senate that Delegate Norton and her House colleagues did recently. So thank you for including me. My apologies for being late. And Bowser, remember this next time we call on a joint funding proposal like you helped save us on the Memorial Bridge. Thank you all.
Mark, you're worth waiting for. Thanks so much for coming. And we're going to have some questions. I'm going to go last, but I'd like to yield. Senator Stabenow and Senator Schumer have had to leave, as we know. Senator Van Hollen is still here. I think Chris is, looks like he might be out of his seat right now. And Ben, would you like to go next with?
Well, let me just, Tom, first, let me thank all of our witnesses. I particularly enjoyed listening to the business owner and the person who served our nation in uniform, and how you have just brought home the fact that there is no justification at all for denying the people of the district statehood, full representation, voting representation in the United States Congress in both the House and the Senate. So I want to ask a political question. To me, this is a no-brainer. It's a human rights issue. And I think Senator Warner raised a good political issue on commuter taxes. I'm not going to get into that. We'll debate that issue, because I think Senator Warner and I will agree on that. And we may have a disagreement with Mayor Bowser, but we can fight those issues out. That's what government's about. But my political question is, how do we get the people of this nation engaged on this issue? We need to make, I'm sure if we do any of our focus groups, people would say yes for DC statehood, but it has not been elevated in this country to where it should be for us to be able to get the political momentum in states that are represented by Republicans right now. So what can we do to put a focus on the politics of this that will perhaps change the equation for some of our Republicans? Look, I hope we can get the bill moving this year. I think it's much more likely that when we have the majority leader next year, we're going to be able to get this done in the Senate. But we need also to recognize that it's going to help all of us to elevate this issue nationally, to get more attention on it. What can we all do to get that done?
I'd like to take a crack at that, because I think it is a salient question that we must face. First, Senator, most Americans don't even know that, according to polls, the DC residents don't have the same rights they have. That may have to do with the fact that we're one district among thousands in the United States, and when they hear me on the floor, I guess they figure we must have statehood. Because on the floor, I'm most of the time not talking about statehood. I'm talking about the same kind of issues that you, Senator, are talking about. So that is one of our frustrations. And if I may say so, what you and the other senators are doing here today is very important to us because it gives it takes away that ignorance by getting across a message that has been very difficult for the district to get across by itself. Now, another thing that I think will help us, Senator, is that we got such a strong vote in the House. Now, that vote included those Democrats who got to Congress by sometimes only 2 or maybe 3 votes themselves. In other words, they came from so-called red states. It is going to be very important that the message comes from them, and that they were not afraid to vote for statehood. And I guess as I heard you, the last thing that occurred to me was to say that House passage itself will send such a strong message because that's so seldom happens in our country that the House passes a bill to bring somebody into the state. That promotes forward movement in a way perhaps nothing else could. So it's a very important question you asked.
And I just really want to compliment you because you have been a voice that's been heard around the nation on this issue. Mayor Bowser, you have been out there and you have added such distinction to this issue by the way that you have provided leadership. So with your congressperson and your mayor, both have been out there that have elevated it, but we need a coordinated strategy to make this a more critical issue for our nation to address.
And absolutely, we would agree with that, Senator. And what we have seen, and the Congresswoman referred to some polling that we've done that our fellow Americans don't know that we're just like them. And when we educate them about that, they become supporters of DC statehood. We have also relied very heavily on our national allies, national groups like the ACLU and others who have members throughout the states and continue to promote the DC message. I will say, however, we have gotten probably more free attention on DC statehood when Americans recognized that our autonomy could be violated by the White House, when they recognized that federal aid during a historic pandemic could be withheld from us for political reasons. And here we are, the seat of government, we support the federal government, and we wouldn't have enough money to respond to the pandemic. And this notion that the federal government, the argument against having a state that's adjacent to the federal district is that the state could become more powerful than the federal government or exert influence on the federal government. And every American with their own eyes saw the exact opposite. And so we have been able, because of this, attack on our autonomy, to talk about why we can only be equal Americans through statehood. And that has given us the opportunity to go in all different kinds of venues and settings and talk to different constituencies. We've also made the case, and Senator Kaine is right that he is new to the bill, and we've seen other senators come on new to the bill, other members of the House come on new to the bill. And so right now, we have more support around Washington, D.C. than we've ever had. We also have interests coming on that have not supported D.C. statehood before, like the Washington Post. And so that we just seen that the argument for fairness and autonomy and equal representation is resonating. And so we will continue with that. Locally, we have been able to do more to support more local advertising and polling and making the business case as well for DC statehood, which can be very powerful. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think that we have significantly closed the ground with the historic number of co-sponsors in the House, as well as increasing numbers of senators signing on to the bill. And we don't give up on the Republicans. I know that our members of our coalition, the DC Vote and Free DC, my office, the Congresswoman, we are calling on those senators as well on many DC issues, including the $750 million we still have to get out of HEROES through the Senate, and other issues that come up as well in DC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cardin, and Senator Van Hart. Chris, you're on. Thanks, buddy.
Yes, thank you, Senator Carper, and thank both the mayor and Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton and the others for their testimony. And Madam Mayor, you brought up the issue of the District of Columbia being shortchanged by $750 million in the CARES Act. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton did the right thing. She got the money in the CARES Act as it came through the, in the House in their proposals, but in the Senate there was the shortchanging. And there are some that have said, well, the District of Columbia doesn't need that extra $700 million. It doesn't have all the demands, despite the fact that, as you testified, DC has been a hot spot. And I want to commend you on your governing during this period of time to try to keep everybody safe, and also working with your neighbors in Maryland and Virginia. So to those who say that the District of Columbia doesn't need that $700 million and doesn't need their full fair amount of funding for the COVID-19 response going forward, can you talk about the impact of that shortchanging on the District of Columbia? Obviously, the best way to resolve this is to make the District of Columbia a state, so no one can play with these formulas the way they did. But we're likely to be taking up the next round of emergency relief in the coming weeks. And so if you could just talk about that, it may be helpful in our efforts.
Absolutely. And as you know, that the federal government's response has been to kick management of the nation's COVID response to governors. And I would be the governor in this instance for the district's response. So we Oh, well.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I lost the mayor on my feed.
He's gone. I think they're having some technical issues.
Yeah.
And Chris, do you have a question while we're waiting for either of our other witnesses, for Monica Hopkins or Mr. Lee?
Well, no, everyone's testimony really covered the key points. I'm grateful for all that they've done, and again to Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, congratulations on this historic vote in the House. We're going to find a way to make it happen in the Senate in the coming time. All right, we'll get it. This is going to happen. I mean, as somebody who was an early supporter of DC statehood, it's great to see the arc bending in the right direction.
There you go. All right, thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Tim Kaine. Tim, please proceed.
I would like to offer a thought about something that hasn't been brought up. It's not really a question, but some of the panelists might want to address it. We've talked about one elephant in the room, which is the issue of racism, and the fact that states like New Mexico and Hawaii had a very difficult time moving from territory to state status because of the predominant Hispanic and Asian American populations. And DC, as the mayor and Eleanor Holmes Norton laid out so plainly, has been victimized by racism in this issue as well. There's also a donkey in the room that we haven't talked about, which is you'll never hear Republicans stand up and say they don't want DC to be a state at a press conference like they had today because it will be a Democratic state. But let's be blunt, that's part of what's going on. They're not going to say that at press conferences, but that's what they're worried about. But the thing I would point out is if DC is Democratic today, it doesn't mean it always will be. I think everyone knows the history. Arizona and New Mexico came in basically at the same time. And Arizona was thought to be the Democratic state and New Mexico the Republican state. That's different today. Hawaii and Alaska came in at the same time in kind of a package deal, people thinking that Hawaii would be the Republican state and Alaska would be the Democratic state. That's different today. These things change over time. The Republican Party was a party that when it mattered to them and when they put up good people, they got a lot of African-American votes and they could be that party again. We shouldn't disenfranchise people based upon their politics. But that is an underlying factor that the other side is worried about. But I think this could be one of the best things possible for the Republican Party, because if DC becomes a state, they'll have to rethink their approach and make significant appeal to African-American voters. And that will be good not only for the voters of DC, it will be good for our nation's two-party democracy. So that was just a comment I wanted to make. I don't know if folks want to comment on it, but that is certainly a factor that is underlying some of the opposition.
Well, Senator Kaine, I would like to thank you for the new knowledge. I was aware of it, but I think you really brought new knowledge to this debate in discussing and making Americans aware that the latest states that came into the Union had to cope with race. So we've been there before and we've overcome this hurdle. And that's important because this country is now majority minority country, or if it's not there yet, it's very close to that. For DC, it's very interesting to know that you would have thought race and race alone would have been the issue. The district has always had a fair number of African Americans. That may be in part because it was close to your state, close to the Mason-Dixon line. One of the first stopovers, as I indicated when I spoke of my own great-grandfather who came from Virginia as a slave to the district. But if you look at the 219 years that there has been a nation's capital, what is most curious is that for most of those 219 years, the majority of the people living here were white, and still the Congress did not want the nation's capital to be a state or to have statehood, or even for most of that period, the district didn't even have full home rule or anything equivalent to it. So the district has had to struggle from the very beginning. The founding fathers didn't mean it that way. They tried their best to make it as equal as they could. They depended upon those who follow them to finish the job. That's where the failure has been for 219 years. So I so much appreciate your taking us through our history so that we see that this is a thread that runs through it that needs to be chopped off, and we can do it with DC statehood.
All righty. I think it's my turn. Can we, any other questions, Tim? Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us. Question, if I can, for Ms. Hopkins, Monica. Opponents of DC statehood have quoted concerns or cited concerns from James Madison that a new state could exert control over Congress by managing its security needs and other essential services. And as I would just ask, is there any, in your view, is there any danger of the new state of Washington, D.C. exerting undue influence over the federal government? And are the concerns that Madison expressed still valid in modern times?
Senator Carper, I thank you for the question. I don't think anybody legitimately is worried about a defenseless government. If that were true, We would be worried about Fort Bragg in North Carolina. We would be worried about the Pentagon in Virginia. We would have, not been seeing what we saw a few weeks ago when the White House, called out the National Guard on DC residents. That is still something that the federal government could do. What changes is that DC can stand up to the federal government. So I think this is, incredibly different in these times.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, and I'm going to ask the same question, Mr. Lee, of you and Mr. Ryman Snyder. It's been suggested that Washington, D.C. just is not diverse enough, that its population is made up of too many people who either work for the federal government or maybe who lobby the federal government. It's also been argued that the district should just rejoin Maryland if its citizens want to vote for senators and House members. Both you and Mr. Ryman Snyder are longtime Washington. What is your reaction to those types of arguments, please?
Could you ask the question one more time? I kind of missed out for a minute.
Sure. It's been suggested that Washington is just not diverse enough, that its population is made up of too many people who either work for the federal government or who lobby the federal government. It's also been argued that the district should just rejoin Maryland if its citizens want to vote for senators and House members. And would you have any reaction to those arguments?
Yeah, I have a strong reaction to that. I don't think that the people who live in Washington would go for that. I definitely can't see that. We need complete autonomy, and we need to have the same rights as folks in Maryland and Virginia, but we don't need to be annexed by them or a part of them. We need to keep the separation the way it is, and then just give Washington the statehood that it deserves. And there's one other thing that I forgot to mention. I know that a lot of the land in Washington, D.C. is owned by the federal government, so that cannot be taxed by Washington, D.C. And then for us to have to go to the Hill and beg for money, the money that it should be ours because we pay taxes, much taxes as anybody else. So, but I can't see us being annexed by Maryland or Virginia. It's nice to have them as neighbors, but that's the way it should be.
Mr. Ryman Snyder, please.
Yes, sir. It's to address your question about diversity. I can tell you, I've lived all over the place. I've lived in New Mexico. I've lived in Kentucky. I've lived in New York. I've lived overseas in multiple countries. And I can tell you without question that DC and growing up here, it's a more diverse place than anywhere else I have spent significant amount of time. Diverse in race, in ethnic background, in what you do for a living. Just on my block alone, just one block of row houses, I have probably 24 different occupations, and the vast minority of them are federal government employees. And I mentioned a couple of those in my remarks. That's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be from DC is our diversity, both our racial, ethnic, and economic diversity. And then, truly blessed to grow up and be educated here within the DC public school system, to be exposed to that, from the time before I can even remember. And that's one of the main reasons why I chose to come back here after my Army service, so I could raise my family and my daughters to appreciate and enjoy that same rich culture that we have here in DC.
All right, Mayor. And the last question is both for the mayor and for a congresswoman. And the mayor, you've got a difficult job. I think you described your job as what? You're the mayor. You're the governor. What else are you? Senator? I don't know. You play a lot of different roles, wear a lot of different hats, but you have a difficult job of running the city every day, knowing that the policies you put forward and the laws you work with the city council to enact can be second guessed or even overturned, as we've seen by the Congress. Congresswoman Norton, I know you spend a lot of your time in the House ensuring that we stay out of DC's way.
Yeah, yes, and I get a lot of help in the Senate. It's interesting that regularly House Republicans try to attach their notions, what they are for, to our appropriation, which, despite raising every cent of that fund money ourselves, has to come here to essentially be signed off by the House and the Senate. So they use that occasion to try to overturn some of our laws. When I don't succeed, as I regularly did not succeed in a Republican House, I have to thank Senate Democrats because they put enough pressure on the Republicans so that most of what I've had to do have only been for a couple of bills because they try to get some consensus on appropriation bills and the Democrats in the Senate simply won't give it to them. And one of the most frustrating experiences I have on an annual basis is fighting Republicans in the House to keep them from overturning the laws passed by the District of Columbia. Obviously, as a city, we are perhaps more progressive than some of their states, but that doesn't give them the right to tell our jurisdiction how to run itself or what our own residents should believe. So I should take this occasion to thank you, Senator, and your colleagues for doing all you can, even in the minority, to stand in the way of those overrides of the wishes of the residents in the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. I'm going to ask the mayor, would you just mind taking a minute, Mayor, to speak to the same issue and to the ways in which your job might be different or maybe even easier if DC were a state?
Senator, I saw something saying that the mayor had lost bandwidth. And so
No,
I think that's why she may be gone.
No, she's here.
For that reason.
She's live and in person. Go ahead, Mayor. We can't hear you, though. You look great, but we cannot hear you. We may have to resort to sign language. Okay. Well, I was going to call on you for any closing statements. So we'll just tell you we love you, and we appreciate you and Eleanor, our special guest, Monica, to you and to James, to Mr. Lee, for being with us on an important day. As well, there's I don't know who said this, but I think it's a fellow who used to be CEO of no, it's Henry Ford. Henry Ford used to say these words. He used to say, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Say, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. In this case, I think we can. And we're stronger together, and we're not going to give up. And I think we're going to win. Thank you all. This has been a great afternoon. Thank you so much. God bless. Thank you.